The morning Catherine Granger told the banker's son to take his flowers and leave her porch was the same morning Kieran Blake first saw her standing in the doorway of that weathered house on the edge of Eldorado Canyon, Nevada, and something in his chest tightened like a cinch strap, pulled too hard. It was 1878, and the high desert town clung to the rocky canyon walls like a stubborn prayer, its buildings sun bleached and worn by the relentless wind that swept down from the mountains. Catherine stood with her arms crossed, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, her mourning dress faded from black to charcoal gray after 2 years of Nevada sun. She was perhaps 25, though the set of her jaw made her seem older, and Kieran watched from his horse as the banker's son, a soft-handed man named Theodore, who had never worked an honest day, stumbled down her porch steps with his rejected bouquet hanging limp in his grip. Kieran was 27, lean and weathered from years working cattle drives between California and the silver mines. He had arrived in Eldorado Canyon 3 days prior, hired by the mining company to break horses and manage their stock. He had no intention of staying long, no intention of putting down roots, and certainly no intention of getting tangled up with a woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with men seeking her favor. But there was something about the way she stood there, alone and defiant, that made him think of his own mother after his father died. How she had raised 3 boys on grit and determination, until fever took her when Kieran was 16. He did not approach Catherine that day. He simply rode past, tipping his hat out of respect, and she gave him a brief nod before going inside and shutting the door firmly behind her. That evening at the boarding house, Kieran learned Catherine's story from Mrs. Patterson, the proprietress who never met a piece of gossip she did not enthusiastically share. Catherine's husband, David Granger, had been a mining engineer, educated back east, who had brought his young wife to Nevada with promises of prosperity. He had been a good man by all accounts, fair and hardworking, and Catherine had loved him deeply. But the mines were dangerous, and 18 months ago, a tunnel collapse had killed David along with 7 other men. Catherine had been left with their small house, a modest savings that was dwindling, and a garden she tended with fierce determination. "That girl has refused every man in this town," Mrs. Patterson said, shaking her head as she served Kieran his supper. "The blacksmith, the assayer, even Mr. Donovan, who owns half the mining operation. She just says no to all of them, polite but firm as bedrock. Some folks think she is still too deep in mourning. Others say she has just decided she is done with men altogether." Kieran ate his beans and cornbread in silence, thinking about the set of Catherine's shoulders, the way she had stood her ground. He understood something about loss, about how it could hollow you out and make you wary of letting anyone close enough to hurt you again. He also understood something about pride, about needing to stand on your own 2 feet even when the world seemed determined to knock you down. The next morning, before dawn, Kieran rose and saddled his horse. He rode out to the scrubland beyond town where juniper and pinyon pine clung to the rocky soil, and he spent 2 hours cutting firewood. The work was familiar and meditative, the swing of the axe, the clean split of wood, the growing pile of fuel that would keep someone warm through the cold desert nights when autumn arrived. When he had a decent load, he tied it to his horse and led the animal toward Catherine's house, arriving just as the first light touched the canyon walls and turned them the color of rust. He did not knock on her door. He simply stacked the firewood neatly beside her back porch, where her previous small pile sat nearly depleted, then mounted his horse and rode to the mining company's corral to begin his day's work. Catherine discovered the firewood an hour later when she went out to start her morning fire for coffee. She stood staring at the neat stack, her brow furrowed in confusion. She looked around the yard, down the dusty road, but saw no one. The wood was good quality, properly seasoned, cut to the right length for her stove. She took what she needed for the day and went back inside, puzzled but not ungrateful. The next morning, Kieran did it again. And the morning after that, by the fourth morning, Catherine was waiting. She opened her back door just as Kieran was finishing his stack, and she stood there in her faded dress with her arms crossed, looking at him with a mixture of suspicion and something that might have been curiosity. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice direct, no nonsense. Kieran straightened, meeting her gaze. Up close he could see her eyes were green as spring grass and there were freckles across her nose that the sun had darkened. "You need firewood," he said simply. "I can provide it." "I did not ask you to." "No, madam, you did not." She studied him for a long moment, and Kieran held still under her scrutiny, letting her look. He was not handsome in any refined way, his face too angular, his jaw too rough with stubble, his hands too calloused and scarred from rope and leather, and the thousand small injuries that came from working with animals. But his eyes were honest, gray as a winter sky, and he met her gaze without flinching or looking away. "I do not need a suitor," Catherine said finally. "I have made that clear to everyone in this town." "I am not courting you," Kieran said, which was not entirely true but also not entirely false. "I am just bringing firewood." "Why?" He considered the question, turning his hat in his hands. "Because you need it and I can do it. Does not seem more complicated than that." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly, looking for the trap, the hidden motive. But Kieran just stood there, calm and patient, waiting. Finally, she gave a short nod. "Thank you for the wood," she said, and went back inside. Kieran returned the next morning with more firewood. And the next. And the next. The town noticed, of course. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it to everyone who came through the boarding house. The banker made a snide comment about stubborn cowboys who did not understand when they were wasting their time. Theodore, the banker's son, rode past Catherine's house one morning and saw Kieran stacking wood, and his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. But Kieran paid no attention to any of it. He simply continued his routine. Rise before dawn, cut wood, deliver it to Catherine's house, then go about his day working with the horses. He did not ask her for anything. He did not linger at her door hoping for conversation. He did not send flowers or write poetry or do any of the things the other men had done. He just brought the firewood, stacked it neatly, and left. 2 weeks passed this way. Catherine found herself listening for the sound of his horse each morning, though she would not have admitted it to anyone, least of all herself. She watched from her kitchen window as he worked, noting the efficient way he moved, the care he took to stack the wood properly so it would shed rain. She noticed he never looked toward her windows, never tried to catch a glimpse of her or engineer a meeting. He simply did the work and left, asking nothing in return. It bothered her, though she could not say exactly why. She was accustomed to men wanting something from her, expecting something, whether it was her hand in marriage or her gratitude or her attention. But Kieran seemed to want none of those things, and it threw her off balance in a way she found both irritating and oddly intriguing. One morning in late September, when the air had begun to carry the first hint of the coming cold season, Catherine made a decision. She rose early, dressed, and had coffee ready when she heard Kieran's horse arrive. She waited until he had finished stacking the wood, then opened her back door and stepped out onto the porch. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. Kieran looked up, surprised. For a moment he seemed about to refuse, then he nodded slowly. "That would be kind of you, madam." "Catherine," she said. "My name is Catherine." "Kieran," he replied, climbing the porch steps and removing his hat. They stood on her back porch in the early morning light, drinking coffee from tin cups, not speaking much. Catherine asked him where he was from, and he told her about growing up in Colorado, about his mother and brothers, about the years he had spent drifting from job to job. His voice was low and measured, and he did not elaborate or embellish. Catherine found she appreciated the straightforward way he spoke, no false charm or calculated words designed to impress her. When the coffee was gone, Kieran thanked her, put his hat back on, and left. But the next morning, when he finished with the firewood, Catherine was again waiting with coffee. And the morning after that, it became their routine. Firewood and coffee, 15 minutes of conversation in the quiet dawn before the town woke up and the day's demands began. Catherine found herself sharing things she had not spoken about in months, telling Kieran about her husband, about how much she missed the life they had been building together, about the loneliness of widowhood and the suffocating pressure of men who thought she needed saving or managing or some combination of both. "I am not helpless," she said one morning, her voice tight with frustration. "David and I were partners. He taught me to manage our finances, to make decisions, to think for myself. But now everyone treats me like I am some fragile creature who cannot possibly survive without a man to take care of me." Kieran nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. "My mother ran our ranch alone for 7 years after my father died," he said. "Kept the books, hired the hands, made all the decisions. She was tougher than any man I have ever met. I learned early that strength has nothing to do with what you are born as and everything to do with what you are made of inside." Catherine looked at him sharply, surprised by the understanding in his words. Most men would have offered platitudes or argued that her situation was different somehow. But Kieran simply accepted what she said and met it with his own experience, treating her as an equal rather than someone who needed to be convinced or comforted. "You miss her," Catherine said quietly. "Every day." They were silent for a moment, sharing the weight of their losses, and Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. October arrived with cold winds that rattled the windows and sent the town's few trees into skeletal silhouettes. Kieran continued bringing firewood every morning, but now the stacks grew larger as Catherine would need more to keep her house warm through the winter. He also began doing other small tasks without being asked, fixing a loose board on her porch steps, replacing a cracked window pane, mending the gate that had been hanging crooked on its hinges since before David died. Catherine protested at first. "You do not need to do all this." "I know," Kieran said, hammering a nail into place. "But it needs doing, and I am here." She wanted to be angry at his presumption, at the way he was slowly making himself indispensable, but she found she could not muster the irritation. There was nothing manipulative in his actions, no sense that he was keeping score or expecting payment. He simply saw things that needed fixing and fixed them, the same way he saw she needed firewood and brought it. "Why?" she asked again, the question that had haunted her since that first morning. "Why do you do this?" Kieran set down his hammer and looked at her directly. "Because when my father died, our neighbors helped my mother. They did not make a big show of it, did not expect anything in return. They just showed up and did what needed doing. Mr. Henderson brought hay for our horses every week for a year. The Johnsons sent over food. Old Pete fixed our roof before winter. My mother cried the first time, said she could not accept charity, but Mr. Henderson told her it was not charity. It was just people taking care of people the way we are supposed to." He picked up the hammer again. "I guess I learned that lesson pretty well." Catherine felt her throat tighten. She had been so focused on maintaining her independence, on proving she did not need anyone, that she had forgotten there was a difference between being forced to accept help and allowing people to care about you. The first was suffocating. The second was just being human. "Thank you," she said softly, and Kieran nodded, understanding she meant for more than just the repairs. The town's opinion of Kieran's efforts was divided. Some people, particularly the women who had themselves been widowed or left alone, approved of his quiet assistance and thought Catherine should count herself lucky to have such a steady man interested in her. Others, particularly the men who had been rejected by Catherine, thought Kieran was a fool wasting his time on a woman who clearly had no interest in remarrying. Theodore, the banker's son, made it his business to spread rumors that Kieran was being taken advantage of, that Catherine was using him for free labor while having no intention of accepting his suit. Kieran ignored all of it. He had learned long ago not to let other people's opinions dictate his actions. He knew what he was doing and why he was doing it, and that was enough. Catherine, however, was more affected by the gossip. She heard the whispers at the general store, saw the knowing looks from other women, felt the weight of the town's judgment and speculation. It made her angry, the way everyone seemed to think they had a right to an opinion about her life, about what she should do or who she should be with. But more than that, it made her think seriously about what was happening between her and Kieran, because something was happening. She could not deny it anymore. She looked forward to their morning conversations with an anticipation that went beyond mere friendliness. She found herself noticing small things about him, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was amused, the gentleness in his hands when he handled the injured horse the mining company had brought him to treat, the sound of his voice when he told stories about his life on the trail. She thought about him during the day when she was tending her garden or mending clothes, wondered what he was doing, if he was safe. It terrified her. She had loved David with her whole heart, and losing him had nearly destroyed her. The grief had been so enormous, so consuming, that there had been days when she was not sure she could survive it. She had survived, but only by building walls around herself, by deciding she would never again give anyone the power to hurt her that way. And now here was Kieran, quietly and persistently dismantling those walls with firewood and coffee and patient kindness, and she did not know whether to let him in or push him away before it was too late. One evening in late October, Catherine sat in her small parlor with David's photograph in her hands, looking at his familiar face in the lamplight. He had been a good husband, gentle and intelligent, always making her laugh even when times were hard. She had been 19 when they married, 23 when he died, and she had truly believed he would be the only man she would ever love. "I do not know what to do," she whispered to the photograph, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I do not know if I am ready. I do not know if I will ever be ready." But David's smile in the photograph was frozen and distant, and he offered no answers because he was gone, and she was still here, still living, still breathing, and she had to decide for herself what came next. The next morning, when Kieran arrived with firewood, Catherine invited him inside for the first time. Her hands shook slightly as she poured coffee at her kitchen table rather than on the porch, this small change feeling monumentally significant. Kieran seemed to understand the weight of the gesture, because he entered her home with careful respect, removing his hat and wiping his boots thoroughly before stepping across the threshold. They sat at her kitchen table, and for a few minutes neither spoke, just sipped their coffee and listened to the wind outside. Finally, Catherine took a breath and said what she had been holding inside for weeks. "I am afraid," she said quietly. "Everyone thinks I refuse suitors because I am still grieving, or because I am stubborn, or because I think I am too good for the men in this town. But the truth is I am just afraid. I loved my husband very much, and losing him almost killed me. I do not know if I can survive that kind of loss again." Kieran set down his cup, his gray eyes serious. "I cannot promise you that you will not lose me," he said honestly. "Life does not offer those guarantees. I work with horses and cattle. I could get kicked in the head tomorrow. Hell, I could get struck by lightning or bit by a rattlesnake or fall off a roof. And even if none of that happens, eventually one of us will die before the other. That is just the nature of being alive." Catherine felt tears threatening again, and she looked away, but Kieran continued, his voice gentle. "But I can promise you that however much time we have, whether it is 50 years or 5, I will spend every day of it grateful that you let me be part of your life. And I think the real question is not whether you might lose me someday, but whether you are willing to let fear of the future steal whatever happiness you might find right now." Catherine looked back at him, seeing the honesty in his face, the vulnerability it took for him to say those words knowing she might still reject him. She thought about the past 2 months, about the quiet steadiness of his presence, about how he had never tried to replace David or push her to move faster than she was ready. He had simply shown up day after day, offering what he could and asking for nothing, until she had slowly, gradually come to trust him. "I am not ready to marry again," she said finally. "I do not know when I will be ready, if ever, but I do not want you to stop coming around. I do not want to go back to being alone." Kieran's face softened with relief and something deeper, something warm that made Catherine's breath catch. "I will be here as long as you want me," he said simply. "No pressure, no expectations, just firewood and coffee and whatever else you need." Catherine reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the rough calluses against her palm, the strength and warmth of his grip. "Thank you," she whispered, and Kieran squeezed her hand gently in return. Their relationship changed after that conversation, becoming something more acknowledged though still undefined. Kieran continued his morning routine, but now he sometimes stayed for breakfast, sitting at Catherine's kitchen table and talking about their plans for the day. Catherine began to emerge from her self-imposed isolation, accepting Kieran's invitation to attend a community dance at the church, standing beside him at the town's harvest celebration, walking with him through Eldorado Canyon on Sunday afternoons when the weather was fine. The town noticed, of course, and gossip swirled with renewed vigor. Some people were happy for Catherine, thinking she had finally come to her senses and accepted that she needed a man. Others were scandalized that she would move on from David's memory. And a few, like Theodore and his father the banker, were bitter that an itinerant cowboy with nothing to his name had succeeded where wealthier, more established men had failed. Catherine discovered she cared less and less what people thought. She was tired of living her life according to other people's expectations and judgments. If they wanted to gossip, let them gossip. She knew the truth of what she felt and what she was building with Kieran, and that was enough. Winter settled over Eldorado Canyon with cold winds and occasional snow that dusted the high desert like powdered sugar. Catherine's woodpile grew impressively large under Kieran's continued efforts, and her house stayed warm even on the coldest nights. Kieran taught her to play chess, and they spent long evenings by her fireplace moving pieces across a wooden board David had made, talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in each other's presence. Catherine found herself laughing more, the sound rusty at first but growing easier with practice. Kieran had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and he told stories from his years on the trail that were sometimes funny, sometimes harrowing, always engaging. She learned that he had once worked briefly as a deputy marshal in Arizona, that he played the harmonica though not particularly well, that he had a horror of spiders completely at odds with his otherwise fearless demeanor. In turn, she shared more about her own life, about growing up in Ohio as the daughter of a shopkeeper, about how she had met David when he came through town on his way west and had fallen for his dreams of adventure and prosperity. She told Kieran about her miscarriage the year before David died, about how she had grieved not only for her husband, but for the children they would never have together. These were things she had told no one else in Eldorado Canyon, secrets she had kept locked tight inside, but with Kieran they emerged slowly, painfully, like splinters being drawn from a wound. Kieran listened to all of it with patient attention, never minimizing her pain or trying to fix things that could not be fixed. He just listened, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. One evening in December, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Catherine asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "How long are you planning to stay in Eldorado Canyon? You said when you arrived that you did not usually stay in one place very long." Kieran was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "I have been thinking about that," he said finally. "The mining company wants me to stay on permanently, manage their stock full-time. It would mean putting down roots, staying in one place. That is not something I have done since I left Colorado." "What are you going to tell them?" Catherine asked, her heart beating faster though she tried to keep her voice neutral. Kieran turned to look at her, the firelight casting shadows across his angular face. "Depends," he said. "Is there a reason I should stay?" Catherine met his gaze, seeing the question behind the question, the vulnerability he was offering her. She could give him a non-committal answer, could keep her options open and her heart protected. Or she could be brave, could take the risk of letting someone close enough to matter again. "Yes," she said softly. "There is a reason." Kieran smiled then, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face, and Catherine felt her own lips curve in response. He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, neither needing to say anything more. Kieran accepted the mining company's offer the next day, and he moved out of the boarding house into a small cabin on the edge of town. It was rough but serviceable, and he set about making it more comfortable with the same patient determination he brought to everything else. Catherine helped him hang curtains she had sewn, and she brought over a quilt she had made the previous winter, and somehow it felt natural and right to be helping him build a home. Christmas came, and Kieran surprised Catherine with a gift he had carved himself, a wooden box with intricate designs on the lid. Inside, he had placed wildflower seeds collected from the canyon, promising that come spring they would plant them together in her garden. Catherine gave him a new shirt she had sewn in deep blue wool, and a book of poetry she had loved, with her favorite verses marked. They spent Christmas evening together at her house, cooking dinner and exchanging stories about Christmases past, and when Kieran left that night, he kissed her forehead gently, a gesture so tender it made Catherine's eyes sting with tears. The new year of 1879 arrived with clear, cold skies and the promise of change hanging in the air. Catherine could feel something shifting inside herself, the way the earth shifted before spring, preparing for new growth. She was not the same woman who had stood on her porch refusing suitors back in September. Grief had not left her, would never entirely leave her, but it no longer defined her every moment. She was learning to carry her love for David alongside her growing feelings for Kieran, understanding that the heart was large enough to hold both past and present, memory and hope. In January, a letter arrived for Catherine from David's family back in Boston. They had finally settled his affairs, and there was a small inheritance coming to her, enough to secure her future and perhaps even expand her house or start a small business if she wished. The money would arrive in the spring, the letter said, and they hoped she was doing well in Nevada. Catherine showed the letter to Kieran that evening, and he read it carefully before handing it back. "That is good news," he said sincerely. "You will have security, independence. You can do whatever you want with your life." "Yes," Catherine agreed, and then, after a pause, "what I want is to build something real here, not just survive, but actually build a life worth living." Kieran looked at her steadily. "What does that look like to you?" Catherine took a breath, her heart racing. "I think it looks like a garden full of flowers in the spring, a house with laughter in it again, maybe children someday if that is possible, and someone to share it all with, someone who sees me as a partner, not someone to take care of or manage, but an equal." "That sounds good," Kieran said quietly. "That sounds real good." They were sitting on Catherine's front porch despite the cold, bundled in coats and watching the stars come out over the canyon. Catherine turned to look at Kieran, at his profile in the fading light, and she felt a certainty settle over her like a blanket, warm and comfortable. "I think I am ready now," she said. Kieran turned to her, understanding immediately what she meant. "Are you sure?" "I am sure that I love you," Catherine said, the words coming easier than she expected. "I am sure that I want you in my life, permanently and completely. I am sure that David would want me to be happy, and that being happy does not mean I loved him any less. And I am sure that if I let fear stop me from building a life with you, I will regret it for the rest of my days." Kieran reached for her hand, his grip strong and steady. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since that first morning when I saw you standing up to Theodore on your porch, all fierce and determined. I will spend the rest of my life earning the trust you are giving me." Catherine leaned forward and kissed him then. Properly kissed him for the first time. And it was nothing like kissing David had been, but that was all right because Kieran was not David, and this was not her old life but her new one. And the newness of it was good and right and full of possibility. When they pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Kieran said, "Marry me. Marry me and let me spend every morning for the rest of my life bringing you firewood and coffee and whatever else you need." Catherine laughed, the sound joyful and free. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in February in the small church in Eldorado Canyon, with Mrs. Patterson weeping happily in the front row, and half the town crowded into the pews to witness Catherine Granger become Catherine Blake. Catherine wore a new dress in deep green that brought out her eyes, and Kieran wore the blue shirt she had made him for Christmas. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran kissed his bride with gentle reverence while the congregation applauded. There was a celebration afterwards at the community hall, with food and music and dancing that lasted into the night. Even some of the men who had previously courted Catherine came to offer their congratulations, their disappointment softened by time and the obvious happiness of the newlyweds. Theodore and his father did not attend, but Catherine found she did not care. She was too busy dancing with her new husband, her face flushed with joy and exertion, feeling lighter than she had in years. They spent their wedding night in Catherine's house, which would now be their house, and Kieran was gentle and patient, treating Catherine with such care and tenderness that she wept, though this time from happiness rather than grief. They lay together afterwards in the darkness, Catherine's head on Kieran's chest, listening to his heartbeat and marveling at how life could surprise you, how pain could eventually give way to hope if you were brave enough to let it. "No regrets?" Kieran asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. "None," Catherine said firmly. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be." Spring arrived with its usual dramatic flair, the desert suddenly erupting in wildflowers after the winter rains. Catherine and Kieran planted the seeds from his Christmas gift, along with vegetable starts and herbs, expanding the garden into something truly impressive. They worked side by side in the warm sunshine, their hands dirty and their backs aching but their spirits high, planning and planting and dreaming about their future. The inheritance money arrived in April, and Catherine and Kieran discussed at length what to do with it. They decided to use part of it to expand the house, adding another bedroom and a larger kitchen. Kieran did most of the work himself, with help from some of the men in town, and by summer they had a home that felt spacious and welcoming, ready for whatever the future might bring. Catherine also used some of the money to start a small business, selling vegetables and preserves from her abundant garden. She had always been good at growing things, and now she channeled that talent into something profitable, setting up a stall at the weekly market and quickly gaining a reputation for the best produce in Eldorado Canyon. Kieran supported her endeavor completely, proud of her initiative, and never once suggesting she should just stay home and keep house like some of the other husbands might have. Their life together settled into a comfortable rhythm. Kieran still rose early to tend the horses and cattle, but now he came home each evening to a wife who greeted him with a kiss and news of her day. They ate dinner together, talking and laughing, and spent their evenings reading or playing chess, or simply sitting together in comfortable silence. On Sundays, they often rode out into the canyon, exploring the rocky landscape and finding quiet spots where they could be alone together, away from the town's watchful eyes. Catherine found herself healing in ways she had not thought possible. The grief for David would always be part of her, a scar on her heart, but it no longer consumed her. She could think of him with fondness rather than devastating loss, could remember their time together with gratitude for what they had shared rather than bitter regret for what had been taken away. And she could love Kieran fully and completely, without reservation, because she had learned that loving one person did not diminish what she had felt for another. The heart, she discovered, could expand to hold multiple truths at once. In the autumn of 1879, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She had hoped for this, prayed for it even, but when the reality finally arrived, she was overwhelmed with a mixture of joy and terror. She had lost a baby before, and the memory of that loss haunted her, making her afraid to hope too much. But Kieran held her close and reminded her that fear could not protect them from the future, that all they could do was face each day with courage and trust that they would handle whatever came together. Catherine made it through the first trimester, then the second, her belly growing round and firm with new life. The women of Eldorado Canyon rallied around her, Mrs. Patterson and the others sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and offering their support. Catherine found herself part of the community in a way she had not been before, no longer the isolated widow but a wife and soon-to-be mother, connected to the web of relationships that made a town feel like home. Kieran was solicitous without being overbearing, bringing Catherine whatever she needed and taking on extra chores without complaint. He talked to her belly in the evenings, telling their unborn child stories about horses and the open range, promising adventures and love and a safe place to grow. Catherine would run her fingers through his dark hair and feel so full of love she thought she might burst with it. Their son was born in May of 1880, on a morning when the wildflowers were in full bloom, and the air smelled of sage and possibility. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Catherine was convinced she would not survive it, but Kieran stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. And finally, their baby arrived with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. They named him Daniel, after Kieran's father, and he was perfect in every way, with a shock of dark hair and serious gray eyes that looked just like his father's. Catherine wept when the midwife placed him in her arms, overcome with relief and joy and a fierce protective love that was almost frightening in its intensity. Kieran kissed his wife's forehead and his son's tiny hand, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We made him," Catherine whispered in wonder. "We made this perfect little person." "We did," Kieran agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And we are going to give him the best life we possibly can." The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Daniel was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still demanded constant attention and care. Catherine was grateful for Kieran's partnership. The way he took his share of the late-night feedings and diaper changes without complaint, never acting like caring for his son was somehow beneath him or women's work. They stumbled through those early months together, learning as they went, making mistakes and laughing at themselves and slowly figuring out how to be parents. As Daniel grew from infant to baby to toddler, Eldorado Canyon continued to change and evolve around them. The silver boom was beginning to slow, and some families were moving on to new opportunities, but others were putting down roots, building businesses and schools and planning for the future. Kieran and Catherine were part of that latter group, investing in their community and their family, creating something lasting and real. Catherine's garden and preserve business continued to thrive, and she took on a young woman named Sarah as an apprentice, teaching her the skills and giving her employment that helped support Sarah's widowed mother. Kieran was promoted to head wrangler for the mining company, with a salary that allowed them to save money and plan for their future. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and secure, and more importantly, they were happy. In 1882, Catherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Kieran's mother. She had the same red gold hair as Catherine, and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone who met her. Daniel, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, his chubby hands patting her gently while he made cooing sounds he had learned from his parents. Kieran looked at his growing family with a sense of awe and gratitude that never quite faded. There were mornings when he would wake before dawn, as was his habit, and he would lie in bed for a few extra minutes just listening to Catherine breathe beside him, thinking about how different his life had turned out from what he had expected. He had thought he would always be a drifter, moving from job to job, never settling down, never having anyone depend on him or anyone he could depend on in return. But Catherine had changed all that, had given him a reason to stop running, had shown him that home was not a place but a person, or in this case, several people who made every day worth living. Catherine felt the same sense of wonder when she looked at what her life had become. She thought sometimes about that younger version of herself, standing on her porch refusing suitors, so certain that she wanted to be alone forever, so convinced that protecting her heart was more important than risking it again. She was grateful to Kieran for being patient with that frightened woman, for showing up every morning with firewood and asking nothing in return, for giving her the time and space she needed to heal and the courage to try again. The years passed in a blur of ordinary moments that somehow added up to an extraordinary life. Daniel started school and proved to be a bright student with a particular talent for numbers. Margaret grew into a spirited child who loved to help her mother in the garden and trail after her father when he worked with the horses. In 1884, Catherine gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas, who was quieter than his siblings but no less loved. The house that had once belonged to a grieving widow was now always full of noise and activity. children running in and out, friends stopping by for dinner, laughter echoing from every room. Catherine's kitchen was the heart of it all, where she cooked and preserved and baked, where she taught her daughter to make bread and her sons to appreciate good food. Kieran added a workshop behind the house where he could work on his carpentry projects, and he taught Daniel how to use tools safely, passing down the skills his own father had taught him. There were hard times too, of course. In 1885, a drought threatened the canyon and Catherine's garden suffered, though she managed to save most of her plants through careful watering and sheer determination. Kieran was injured that same year when a horse threw him, breaking his arm badly enough that he could not work for 6 weeks. Catherine nursed him through the pain and frustration, and they relied on their savings and the support of their community to get through the difficult period. But even the hard times seemed manageable because they faced them together. That was the gift Kieran had given Catherine all those years ago when he first showed up with Firewood. The understanding that life was easier and better when you did not have to shoulder every burden alone. And it was the gift Catherine had given him in return when she finally let down her walls and allowed him into her heart, the chance to be part of something larger than himself, to build and create and love without reservation. By 1890, Eldorado Canyon was a different place than it had been when Catherine first arrived as a young bride. The silver boom had gone bust, and many of the mines had closed, but the town had adapted, finding new ways to survive and thrive. Some families had left, but others had stayed, determined to make a life in this harsh, beautiful landscape. The Blakes were among those who stayed, their roots now deep in the rocky soil. Daniel was 10 years old and already talking about becoming an engineer like Catherine's first husband had been, inspired by the stories his mother told about David. Catherine encouraged his interest, grateful that she could speak of David freely with her children, that Kieran had never been threatened by her past or tried to erase it. Margaret was 8 and wanted to be a teacher, spending her free time organizing lessons for her younger brother and the neighborhood children. Thomas was 6, quiet and thoughtful, happiest when he was helping his father with the horses. Kieran was 40 now, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples, lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. Catherine was 37, her figure fuller than it had been in her youth, her hands roughened from garden work but still capable and strong. They were no longer young, but they were content, having built exactly the kind of life they had dreamed of on that cold January night when Catherine had first said she was ready. One morning in the spring of 1891, Kieran woke before dawn as usual and lay in bed listening to Catherine breathe beside him. Outside their window, the canyon was still dark, the stars just beginning to fade as the first hint of light touched the horizon. In the next rooms, their children slept peacefully, safe and warm and loved. The house smelled faintly of the bread Catherine had baked the previous day, and Kieran could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood tree they had planted in the yard 5 years ago. He thought about getting up to cut firewood, a habit so ingrained after all these years that his body automatically wanted to begin that familiar routine. But there was already plenty of wood stacked neatly by the back door, enough to last for weeks. These days they worked together to keep the woodpile stocked, Catherine often helping him with the stacking while the children played nearby, the task they had once done separately now just another part of their shared life. Still, Kieran found himself getting up quietly, careful not to wake Catherine and pulling on his clothes. He went outside into the pre-dawn stillness and walked to the woodpile, running his hand over the smooth surface of the stacked logs. He remembered that first morning so clearly, how nervous he had been, how uncertain whether his simple gesture would be seen as intrusive or helpful. He had not known then what would come of it, had not dared to hope that the fierce, sad woman on the porch would eventually become his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in building a life. Could not sleep. Kieran turned to find Catherine standing in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked beautiful in the dim light, and Kieran felt his heart squeeze with love as it still did after all these years. "Just thinking," he said, walking back toward her. "Remembering," Catherine smiled, understanding immediately. 13 years, she said softly. 13 years since that first morning you showed up with firewood. Best decision I ever made, Kieran said, climbing the steps and putting his arms around her. Catherine leaned into his embrace, resting her head on his chest. "I was so scared," she admitted. "So determined not to let anyone close. I think about that sometimes, how close I came to sending you away like I did all the others." "But you did not," Kieran reminded her. "You were brave enough to take a chance." "We both were," Catherine corrected. She pulled back to look up at him, her green eyes soft in the growing light. "Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for showing up every morning even when I gave you no encouragement, no reason to hope." Kieran cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "You were worth waiting for," he said simply. "You and the children and this life we built together, all of it was worth every moment of uncertainty." They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that held 13 years of love and partnership and shared history. When they pulled apart, the sun was just breaking over the canyon rim, flooding the world with golden light. Inside the house, they could hear the children beginning to wake, Thomas's voice calling for his mother, Margaret laughing at something Daniel had said. "We should go in," Catherine said reluctantly. "Start breakfast before they come looking for us." But Kieran held her a moment longer, wanting to savor this perfect moment before the day's demands began. "I love you," he said, the words as true now as the first time he had spoken them. "I love our life together. I love who we have become." "I love you too," Catherine said, her eyes shining. "More than I ever thought possible after David. You gave me a second chance at happiness, and I will never stop being grateful for that." They went inside together hand in hand, ready to face another day of the ordinary, extraordinary life they had built together. Kieran put coffee on to boil while Catherine started on breakfast. The children tumbled into the kitchen one by one, sleepy and hungry, and soon the room was full of noise and activity, and the particular chaos that came with a busy family. As Kieran watched his wife laugh at something Margaret said, as he helped Thomas with his shoelaces and listened to Daniel's excited plans for the day, he felt a profound sense of peace and rightness. This was what he had been searching for all those years on the trail, though he had not known it at the time. Not adventure or freedom or the next job, but this. A home full of love, a partner who saw him truly and loved him anyway, children who would carry their legacy forward into the future. And it had all started with firewood, with the simple act of seeing a need and meeting it, of showing up day after day with no guarantee of reward, trusting that patience and persistence and genuine caring would eventually break through even the strongest walls. The years continued to unfold, bringing both joy and sorrow as all lives do. In 1893, Mrs. Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep, and the whole town mourned the loss of their unofficial matriarch. Catherine and Kieran attended her funeral, and shared stories of how she had welcomed Kieran when he first arrived in Eldorado Canyon, how she had been the first to tell him about the stubborn widow who refused all suitors. In 1895, Catherine received word that David's mother had died back in Boston, and she wept for the woman who had welcomed her as a daughter-in-law, who had never blamed Catherine for her son's death or for eventually moving on with her life. Kieran held her while she cried and later helped her write letters to David's remaining family, maintaining connections that honored the past without dwelling in it. But there were joys too, many joys. In 1896, Daniel graduated from school at the top of his class and accepted a position as an apprentice engineer with a mining company in Virginia City. Catherine was sad to see him go, but proud of the young man he had become, serious and hardworking and kind like both his fathers in different ways. Margaret declared she was going to follow in her mother's footsteps and started her own small garden business, showing the same determination and skill that Catherine had. Thomas discovered he had his father's gift with animals and began working alongside Kieran, learning everything he could about training horses. In 1898, on a warm spring evening, Kieran and Catherine sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. Their children were grown or nearly so, their house was paid off, their business was stable, and they had everything they had ever hoped for and more. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as they had done 1,000 times before, content in each other's presence. "Do you ever think about how different everything could have been?" Catherine asked suddenly. "If you had not decided to bring me firewood that first morning," Kieran considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think about all the ways it could have gone wrong, how you could have told me to stop, how I could have given up after a few weeks, how we could have missed each other entirely if the timing had been just slightly different. It frightens me sometimes," Catherine said quietly, "knowing how close I came to staying locked away in my grief forever." Kieran squeezed her hand. "But you did not. You chose to be brave, to take a risk, to build something new instead of just protecting yourself from more pain. That took tremendous courage." Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the colors deepen in the sky. "We did it together," she said. "That is what made it possible. You gave me time and space to heal, and I gave you a reason to finally put down roots. We each gave the other what we needed most." "That is what love is supposed to be," Kieran said softly. "Not just romance and passion, though we have had plenty of that, but partnership, mutual support, two people choosing each other every day and working together to build a life worth living." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear Margaret humming as she washed dishes, Thomas reading aloud to himself as he studied. Their life had become so full, so rich with connection and meaning, and it all traced back to that first morning when a stubborn cowboy had decided to show up with firewood for a widow who had made it very clear she wanted nothing to do with Suitors. In the summer of 1900, as the new century began, Catherine and Kieran celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together friends and family from all over Nevada. Daniel came home from Virginia City with a young woman he was courting, an engineer like himself, and Catherine liked her immediately for her intelligence and her independent spirit. Margaret announced she was going to attend normal school to become a teacher, fulfilling the dream she had held since childhood. Thomas, now 16, was already being sought out for his horse training skills, his reputation growing throughout the territory. During the party, after the cake had been eaten and the dancing had begun, Catherine pulled Kieran aside for a quiet moment alone. They walked to the edge of the property where they could see the lights of Eldorado Canyon spread out below them, hear the faint sound of music and laughter from their celebration. 20 years, Catherine said wonderingly. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Kieran agreed. He put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. I still feel like I am just getting to know you sometimes, discovering new things about you. And then other times it feels like you have always been part of me, like I cannot remember what life was like before you." Catherine turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "I want you to know something," she said seriously. "I want you to know that I have never once regretted choosing you, choosing this life. There have been hard times and struggles and moments when things were not easy. But through all of it, I have never doubted that we were meant to find each other, that everything I went through before, even the loss of David, somehow led me to exactly where I needed to be." Kieran felt his throat tighten with emotion. After 20 years of marriage, his wife could still reduce him to speechless gratitude with her honesty and love. "I feel the same," he managed to say. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Catherine Blake. You and our children and this life we built together brick by brick and day by day." They kissed under the stars, these two middle-aged people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. When they returned to the party, their children noticed the glow on their faces and exchanged knowing glances, grateful for parents who still loved each other so obviously and completely. The years that followed brought more changes. Nevada became a state, and Eldorado Canyon continued its slow evolution from mining town to something more permanent and stable. Catherine's business expanded, and she hired more help, becoming known throughout the territory for her preserves and produce. Kieran eventually transitioned from active wrangling to teaching others his skills, training a new generation in the art of working with horses. They were respected elders in their community now, the couple people pointed to as an example of what marriage could be when two people truly partnered with each other. In 1902, Daniel married his engineer, and they settled in Virginia City, where they would eventually have 3 children of their own. Margaret finished her schooling and took a position as a teacher in Eldorado Canyon, where she could stay close to her parents while still pursuing her career. She would later marry a kind schoolteacher named Robert, and they would have 2 children. Thomas remained unmarried for many years, focused on building his horse training business, though he lived nearby and visited his parents frequently. Catherine and Kieran grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of lives well lived. But their love never diminished, never became routine or taken for granted. They still had their morning coffee together, though these days they both prepared it rather than Kieran bringing it as a peace offering. They still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They still held hands when they walked through town. They still looked at each other with the same wonder and gratitude they had felt on their wedding day. On a cold morning, in January of 1909, Kieran woke early as was his lifelong habit. He was 58 now, his body stiff with age but still strong. Beside him, Catherine slept peacefully, her face relaxed in the morning light. She would be 56 soon, her hair pure silver, her hands permanently stained from years of garden work. But to Kieran she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her standing fierce and determined on her porch. He thought about getting up, about starting coffee and beginning the day's routine. But instead he stayed in bed, watching his wife sleep, thinking about the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of their life together. 31 years since that first morning when he had cut firewood for a stranger. 27 years since they had married. 26 years since their first child was born. Thousands upon thousands of mornings he had woken up beside this woman, and he had never once stopped being grateful for the chance. Catherine stirred, her eyes opening slowly. When she saw Kieran watching her, she smiled, that same smile that had first cracked her grief-hardened shell all those years ago. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "Firewood," Kieran said with a slight grin. "I was thinking maybe I should go cut some firewood." Catherine laughed, the sound still musical despite her age. "We have plenty of firewood, old man. Our son cut enough to last us through 2 winters." "I know," Kieran said. "But I was thinking about that first morning when I brought you firewood, how nervous I was, how I had no idea if you would appreciate it or tell me to stop bothering you." "Best thing you ever did," Catherine said, reaching over to touch his face gently. "Showing up every morning with no expectations, just offering what you could. You wore down my defenses 1 armload of wood at a time." "It was not about wearing down your defenses," Kieran protested. "It was about you needing firewood and me being able to provide it." "It was about both," Catherine corrected. "You saw past my refusals to the lonely, grieving woman underneath, and you decided to care for her anyway, even when she gave you nothing in return. That was extraordinary, Kieran. That was love before I was ready to receive it, patience when others had given up, persistence born from genuine caring rather than ego or desire to win." Kieran pulled his wife into his arms, holding her close. "We saved each other," he said simply. "You gave me a reason to stop running, and I gave you a reason to start living again. That is what makes it work, that balance, that mutual rescue." They lay together in the early morning quiet, listening to the house settle around them, the home they had built together through decades of partnership and love. Eventually, they would need to get up, to face the day's demands, to continue the work of living. But for now, they simply held each other, grateful beyond words for the chance they had taken on each other all those years ago. By 1915, as the world prepared to plunge into war, Kieran and Catherine were in their 60s, their children grown and scattered, their house quiet again after years of noise and activity. They had grandchildren now, 7 in total, who visited regularly and brought new life and energy into their home. They had lived to see automobiles and telephones, marveling at how much the world had changed since they first met, but some things never changed. Kieran still woke early most mornings, though he no longer worked full-time. Catherine still tended her garden, though she moved more slowly now and hired young people to do the heavy work. They still had their coffee together each morning, still talked for hours, still held hands when they walked. They were old now, facing the reality that their time together was finite, but they faced it without fear because they had lived fully and loved completely and built something that would outlast them both. One evening in the summer of 1917, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Catherine asked Kieran a question she had been pondering. "Do you think we will find each other again, after this life?" Kieran looked at his wife, at the face he had loved for nearly 40 years, and he felt certain in his answer. "Yes," he said firmly. "I do not know how the next life works or what form it takes, but I believe some connections are too strong to be broken by something as small as death. We found each other once against all odds. I have to believe we will find each other again." Catherine smiled, tears slipping down her wrinkled cheeks. "I like to think so too, and maybe next time I will not make you work so hard to get past my defenses." "I would wait 100 lifetimes if that is what it took," Kieran said honestly. "You have always been worth the wait." They kissed then, these 2 old people who had grown into each other over decades, who knew every line and scar and story that made up the other's life. When they pulled apart, the last light was fading from the sky, and the canyon was settling into its evening song of insects and distant coyotes. "Come on," Catherine said, standing slowly and reaching for Kieran's hand. "Let us go inside. I made your favorite pie for dessert." Kieran took her hand, marveling as he always did at how perfectly it fit in his, and together they walked into their home, ready for whatever time they had left, secure in the knowledge that they had lived and loved exactly as they were meant to. The years continued their steady march, bringing both loss and new life. In 1918, the Spanish flu swept through Nevada and Catherine fell ill. For 2 weeks, Kieran nursed her with the same patient dedication he had shown her decades earlier, barely sleeping, constantly by her side, refusing to even consider the possibility of losing her. Catherine was strong, though, tougher than she looked, and she recovered slowly, emerging from her illness thin and weak but alive. The experience shook them both, a reminder that their time was not infinite. They began to talk more seriously about their legacy, about what they wanted to leave behind. They worked with their children to ensure the house and property would stay in the family, that the business Catherine had built would continue. They wrote letters to their grandchildren, sharing stories and wisdom they hoped would guide them through their own lives. But mostly, they just loved each other, fiercely and completely, making the most of every day they had left. They laughed together, sometimes at nothing more than the absurdity of growing old. They cried together when old friends passed away or when the news from Europe grew too grim. They held each other through the long nights when age made sleep elusive, finding comfort in shared wakefulness. In the spring of 1920, on a morning that felt no different from any other, Kieran woke to find Catherine still sleeping beside him. The sun was just beginning to paint the canyon walls gold and birds were singing their morning songs. Kieran started to get up, then paused, looking back at his wife. Something about her stillness made him reach out, touch her shoulder gently. She did not wake. The grief was enormous, a wave that threatened to drown him. But beneath the grief was gratitude, vast and sustaining. 42 years they had been together, 42 years of partnership and love and shared life. She had died peacefully in her sleep, in her own bed with her husband beside her. There were worse ways to leave this world. Kieran sat with Catherine for a long time, holding her cooling hand, saying goodbye to the woman who had been his anchor and his joy for more than 4 decades. He told her all the things he had said 1,000 times before, but needed to say once more. That he loved her, that she had made his life complete, that he would carry her with him always. And when he was finally ready, he kissed her forehead gently and went to wake their children with the news that would break their hearts. Catherine's funeral was well attended, the whole town turning out to pay their respects to a woman who had been a pillar of their community for over 40 years. Her children and grandchildren gathered, sharing memories and tears. The preacher spoke of Catherine's strength, her generosity, her unwavering spirit. But it was Kieran who gave the final words, standing beside his wife's casket with tears streaming down his lined face. The day I first saw Catherine, she was refusing a suitor on her porch, making it very clear she wanted nothing to do with men seeking her favor, he said, his voice rough but steady. I could have listened to that message and left her alone. But something told me she did not need another man pushing himself on her, making demands or expecting things. She needed someone who would just show up and help, no strings attached, no expectations. So I brought her firewood every morning, just firewood and nothing more. And slowly, over time, she let me into her life, into her heart, and she gave me 42 years of the greatest happiness I have ever known. He paused, struggling to continue. Catherine taught me that love is not about grand gestures or sweeping romance, though we had our share of that too. Love is showing up every day, doing what needs doing, being there through the mundane and the difficult and the beautiful. Love is patience when someone is not ready. Love is courage when you have been hurt before. Love is choosing the same person over and over, day after day, year after year, building something together that is stronger than either of you could be alone. His voice broke then, and his son Daniel came to stand beside him, offering support. Kieran took a shaky breath and finished. I will miss her every moment of every day for whatever time I have left. But I am grateful beyond measure for the life we built together, for the children we raised, for the love we shared. Catherine Granger Blake was the finest person I have ever known, and I was blessed beyond belief that she chose to spend her life with me. Kieran lived for 3 more years after Catherine's death. Years he filled with his children and grandchildren, with work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He told stories about Catherine to anyone who would listen, keeping her memory alive through words and laughter and occasional tears. He tended her grave faithfully, planting the wildflowers she had loved, sitting beside her stone and talking to her as if she could hear him. Maybe she could. He liked to think so. On a cold morning in January of 1923, Kieran died peacefully in his sleep in the same bed where he had spent decades beside his wife. He was 72 years old, and he had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and purpose and meaning. His children buried him beside Catherine in the Eldorado Canyon cemetery, their stones side by side, marking the final resting place of 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary from simple beginnings. The epitaph on their shared stone reads simply, "Together they built a life worth living." In the years that followed, their story became part of Eldorado Canyon's history. The tale of the stubborn widow who refused all suitors and the patient cowboy who showed up every morning with firewood until she let him into her heart. Grandchildren told the story to their own children, and the house where Kieran and Catherine had lived remained in the family for generations, a testament to what they had built together. The story resonated because it spoke to something fundamental about love and persistence, and the courage it takes to try again after loss. It reminded people that sometimes the grandest romances start with the smallest gestures, that patience and genuine caring can accomplish what force and pressure never could, that showing up consistently matters more than flashy displays. Daniel, who lived to be 85, never tired of telling people about his parents' love story. He would describe how his father had courted his mother through simple acts of service, how his mother had been brave enough to risk her heart again after devastating loss, how together they had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Margaret wrote a book about her parents when she was an old woman, preserving their story for future generations. She included letters they had written, photographs from their life together, interviews with people who had known them. The book was never widely published, but it was treasured by their family, a record of what real love looked like when stripped of all pretense and romance novel fantasy. Thomas, who never married, spent his life continuing his father's horse training work and caring for his parents' property. He maintained the house exactly as they had left it, preserving it as a kind of shrine to the life they had built. When he died at 70, he left the property to his nephew with explicit instructions that it should remain in the family, that the story of Kieran and Catherine should never be forgotten, and it was not forgotten. Over the decades, as Eldorado Canyon grew and changed, as Nevada evolved from territory to state to modern hub, the story of the widow and the cowboy remained part of the local lore. The house still stood, weathered but sturdy, maintained by succeeding generations of Blakes who felt the weight of their ancestors' legacy and were determined to honor it. On warm spring mornings when the wildflowers bloomed across the canyon, people claimed they could sometimes see the ghost of a cowboy cutting firewood, or the shade of a woman tending her garden, working side by side as they had in life. Whether these were true ghosts or just tricks of light and memory, the stories persisted, adding to the legend. But the real legacy of Kieran and Catherine Blake was not in ghost stories or legends. It was in the lives they had touched, the children they had raised, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward into the future. It was in the understanding that love could survive loss, that patience could overcome fear, that showing up day after day with no expectations was sometimes the most romantic gesture of all. Their story was a reminder that the best love stories are not always the ones that happen quickly or easily. Sometimes the greatest romances are built slowly, carefully, one act of kindness at a time, by two people brave enough to try again after their hearts have been broken. Sometimes love is as simple and profound as a man bringing firewood to a widow who has said she wants nothing to do with suitors, until gradually, persistently, patiently, he shows her that he is offering something different: partnership, respect, steadiness, and a love that asks for nothing but gives everything. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The Blake family continued to grow and flourish, spreading across Nevada and beyond. But they always traced their roots back to that house on the edge of Eldorado Canyon, to the widow and the cowboy who had found each other in 1878 and built a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. Their story became a touchstone, a reminder of what was possible when two people chose each other with clear eyes and open hearts, when they worked together through joy and sorrow, when they built something real and lasting from the simplest of beginnings: firewood and coffee, patience and courage, showing up every day. These were the building blocks of the greatest love story Eldorado Canyon had ever known. And generations later, people still told the tale with reverence and wonder, still marveled that something so extraordinary could grow from something so simple, still hoped that they too might find a love as true and lasting as the one Kieran and Catherine Blake had shared. And so the story lived on, as all the best love stories do, passed down through the years, inspiring new generations to be patient, to be brave, to show up for the people they love even when the outcome is uncertain. Because in the end, that was what love required. Not grand gestures or perfect words, but simple, consistent presence, day after day, year after year, building a life together one moment at a time until those moments added up to something beautiful and enduring and absolutely worth every risk taken along the way.